Uh, if you work in football, you live in a random and chaotic world. In a random and chaotic world, we create noise. And there is noise that is evident in all of the information that we collect in relation to players. Sometimes the noise might be relatively small, sometimes it might be relatively large. But if you're a practitioner and you're collecting data, you should be trying to quantify the boundaries of that noise, because that will then give you the capacity to understand when something that we observe that is beyond these boundaries and is meaningful is the trigger for meaningful conversations.
Hi, Chris. Welcome to this video chat. Nice to meet you today. How are things with you?
I'm good, thanks, Michael. It's nice to meet you too. And thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this recording.
Perfect. So for those who are listening into this and looking at this who don't know who you are, can you just give a short, brief overview of your career, what you've done, if there are any highlights or anything such as, interesting things you would like to share before we start the conversation about today's topic?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Chris Barnes. I have now worked in football for around about 26 or 27 years. First of all, with an English Premier League club, which I worked with for 12 years. And I have to say it was particularly exciting times. Because when I joined, I was actually the first full-time appointment of a sports scientist in the Premier League, which in its own right was, I guess, in equal measures exciting because of the opportunity, but totally daunting because if the truth be known, I didn't really have a clue what I was doing because there wasn't a rule book, there wasn't a script to follow. And I would say we had success. We retained our position in the Premier League for that period of time. And then in 2009, we parted company and I went on my own. I formed my own company and have been in that position now for the past 15 years. But then, of course, where you and I met was through some of the work that I've done of late as a member of the UEFA Football Fitness Advisory Group.
That is, it's quite an extensive career you've had so far, and still going.
Oh, well, there was actually a lot more that went before it, I'm afraid, as well. But I know we're limited on time, so let's stay where we are for now.
I think you could tell a lot more of what you've done, but let's jump to what we're actually here to talk about and today's topic, which is performance tracking supported by SPC. So we'll do it like this. Imagine that I'm a normal guy you meet up in the city, just walking by. Okay, explain to me, what is SPC and what can it be used for?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, SPC, as we know, it's nothing new. Statistical process control has actually been around for the best part of 100 years, to my knowledge, with its origins being in manufacturing industry. Now, in a nutshell, what statistical process control is about, it's about identifying when you may have a red flag in a system. Now, we effectively do that in football with a lot of the data that we collect nowadays on the players that we work with. And so the same process can be used. The way it works is based around your classical descriptive statistics, which is the average of whatever it is you're measuring, and a measure of variance or dispersion, which is standard deviation. So if we then set up a system whereby we are looking at consecutive data points based on an average that we've already determined or a mean, and then we look at 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations outside of that point, then we use a set of rules. And this is where statistical process control is one method of working with this kind of data. is really, really quite neat because it's quite simplistic. And there are a set of rules that will identify when something occurs that we should be interested in. So it could be in relation to how far from the average a piece of data sits. So if it's more than 3 standard deviations outside of the mean or beyond the mean in 2 of 3 consecutive data points, that could be considered a red flag. But then there are other rules that we can also use within this. So if we identify a trend where things may be continuously increasing for 6 or maybe 7 consecutive points, or decreasing for 6 or 7 consecutive points, that then becomes a red flag.
That was a great explanation. I know you talk about red flags, and I just want to ask if we talk the opposite way. So if you're measuring physical performance and you want to improve your performance and you want to statistically prove to the players that, okay, the things we've been doing in the gym has actually moved your baseline upwards. I assume that's also possible by using the same method, but then it might, if you can say it's a green flag instead of a red flag.
100%. It's rather than a red flag, let's talk about this as a change in performance then. And it's a change, or it's an observation that is outside of what has gone before. And at certain times, obviously, we will have interventions with players where we are seeking some kind of a response, a reaction in terms of a change in performance. Now, this is an ideal tool to use to identify those occurrences, because the way in which you would use it is if you had a squad of 16 players, let's say, the reality of the situation is if you put an intervention into those 16 players, not all of them will respond. They'll all respond slightly differently. And you'll get some that may respond very positively with really, really strong positive results. And there'll be others that might be total non-responders. And what this will allow us to do is to identify those where we've seen a really positive change in performance. But if we've got others that, for whatever reason, aren't reacting to the stimulus that we've chosen to give them, then there's a trigger there to say, okay, well, let's approach this differently. And we'll try a slightly different approach with different routines, different exercises, whatever that might be, to try and trigger the positive change in performance that we're looking for.
Yeah, because I just can take from my career and my experience that it has most of the time been a subjective feeling that, okay, I actually feel that I'm a bit fatigued, I feel a bit tired. But with this method, which I think would have gained in my own career, that you can actually see, okay, statistically, okay, you're actually improving or not improving over time, just to look at those different things. So I would have benefited from having one of these things in line when I was playing myself.
And I guess, two things I would say to that. I mean, in the first place, we spend a lot of time in football clubs collecting subjective information, be that about readiness to perform or recovery from performance. We can use statistical process control on regular monitoring measurements, such as measures of readiness or recovery, just to see where we are actually with the players that we're working with at any point in time. I think the thing that we're trying to do with these approaches, whether it's statistical process control, whether it's using typical error of measurement, what we're trying to do is to say, look, we know that we have these fluctuations in an awful lot of these data, which are a natural artifact of what it is that we're measuring. But what they allow us to do is to understand when we step out of the normal variance and variation here, and that there actually is a conversation to be had. But surely we should be using some form of simple algorithm or statistic to show us with confidence that any change that we observe is a real change, and it's not actually something that's purely an artifact of the test that we're actually performing.
And what would you say in regards to, and there's a lot of technology flying around the world in sports tech, and I think it's a new era where tech is taking over everything. What do you feel like technology is helping coaches and physios, performance coaches today in regards to SPC and other things like TEM? How does that help coaches today in today's environment with all the data that they have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We're talking about the sport of football. Football is the most random and chaotic team sport. If sports scientists wanted an easy life, I often say that they really should have gone into one of these linear sports where you go from A to B, like cycling or rowing, where they're heavily driven by physiology. Football isn't like that. There are so many influencing factors, particularly in a game, on physical performances. So we do see huge variance, huge variation, particularly in some of the high intensity metrics there. If we take a step back from that, though, and give a concrete example of where these approaches are particularly useful. Let's take, for example, a 10-meter sprint test, 10-meter linear speed test. It's very, very easy for us to identify the latent noise in that test. So if you have a player whose time for a 10-meter standing start sprint is 1.8 seconds, the question would be, okay, on the next occasion you do this test, it's 1.77 seconds. So that's a 0.03 second difference. And it's at one level, you could say it's a 0.03 second improvement. But if I was to tell you that, certainly when we've looked at the noise in these tests, and the noise is normally 0.04 to 0.06 seconds, we've seen a 0.03 second change. That is within the natural variation, the natural noise. So we don't go jumping up and down about that change for the player or maybe the player's parents or maybe the coach, because we can't say with confidence that that is a change. But if that difference in performance were 0.07 seconds, then we can come and do all of the fist bumps and high fives, and backslapping with the coach and with the players, because we can say with confidence that there is a real change in performance there. Now, that's one concrete example. For me, if you're working with the technology, the first thing that you should be doing is to quantify the natural variance in the metrics that you might derive from it. So for yourselves, for example, with Photon Sports, I know you've got a large battery of tests that the technology will provide feedback on. If I was in a club and I was to take on board Photon Sports and use it for 3 or 4 different profiling tests, the first thing that I would do is ensure that I'd quantified the level of variance in those tests. Now, with testing, generally speaking, it will be relatively small because testing is something that you do place a high level of control on.
Do you see any, if we talk a bit more about like the future of sports, do you see any implementation of SPC that you haven't used or tried yourself yet that might be useful, or you think that the market is going in the correct way with interpreting all the data that we have today? Or is there anything new that comes to mind that, okay, maybe this could be a thing within, in this case, football, that SPC could be used for more frequently, more often, or maybe every day?
It could. You sort of hit the nail on the head a little bit at the end there. Because statistical process control relies on establishing this mean and standard deviation for your data, you want that data to be current and meaningful. So we need to be collecting data on a regular basis. So that's more of a monitor. If we distinguish here between monitoring and testing as building the movie, or in terms of testing, you get a snapshot in time. It's the movie that we're interested in. So anything that we're collecting information on a regular basis, then for sure SPC can be used to evaluate that.
That's really insightful and good to hear. To be honest, I had a lot of questions, but it feels like we have just gone back and forth into every question. So I think it's actually time to just summarize this a bit. And if you could just summarize shortly about SPC and the things we've speaking about. So main thing, of course, first, why is SPC a good tool to use? How is it supposed to be applied in your normal day-to-day work? And what could it, in terms of benefits over time, how could this benefit a team over time to use this?
Well, yeah, for sure. If you work in football, you live in a random and chaotic world. In a random and chaotic world, we create noise. And there is noise that is evident in all of the information that we collect in relation to players. Sometimes the noise might be relatively small, sometimes it might be relatively large. But if you're a practitioner and you're collecting data, you should be trying to quantify the boundaries of that noise, because that will then give you the capacity to understand when something that we observe that is beyond these boundaries and is meaningful is the trigger for meaningful conversations, either with a player, if it's only for one player or maybe two players, or if it's for a number of players, it's a conversation with a coach. In my experience, when we've got this information to back it up, and it could be from using a technique such as statistical process control, but when we're not actually trying to sell a story every day, but we're actually picking out the story when it matters, then we're not wasting coaches' time, we're not wasting players' time. We've got a good use of time, and the coach and the players do know that when you've got something to say, it's because it's something important to say. So the message carries so much more weight.
I think that was a great summary, and I really appreciate this talk. And it was great to having you on board for this chat, Chris. So thank you from my side, and I think that's a wrap.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.